Yes, well, in fact, I'd already written a book on the Trinity, which subsequently has gone into a second expanded edition back in 2019. While that was still in process, the publisher suggested to me that I write on the Holy Spirit, since obviously there's been a lot of discussion in that particular area over the last few decades. And once I'd signed that contract, the publisher approached me and said, why not make it a trilogy? I'm working now actually on a book on the Son, which actually will be probably a bit larger than the one on the Spirit. And the third one will be on the Father, which I think will probably be a little bit shorter. But one can say that it does follow the order, not so much of God's own revelation of himself, but of our response. We respond to God through the work of the Spirit, who directs us to Christ, our mediator, and thus to the Father, as Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 2, through him, through Christ, we both, Jew and Gentile, have access by one Spirit to the Father. So, yeah, it follows a biblical and rational order, but the reverse order to what one might suppose if one was going on the order of God's revelation. It matters certainly in the sense that it was the theological occasion for the separation of the Western and Eastern churches back in the 11th century. So they certainly thought it mattered a lot. And it does represent two distinct ways of viewing the Trinity from our perspective. The Greek and Russian churches, those in the general ambit of the Orthodoxy, are strongly insistent that the Father is the source of the personal subsistence of the Son and the Holy Spirit. And consequently, just as the Son is begotten by the Father, so the Spirit proceeds from the Father. Whereas in the Latin Church, which of course stems from Rome and includes both Rome and Protestantism, the stress has been on the deity of Christ, the Son being of one identical being with the Father. And the story goes that where this appeared to be threatened in the 6th and 7th centuries in Spain by a revival of the heresy of Arianism, which denied the deity of the Son, the clause "and the Son," filioque, was inserted into the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, the Nicene Creed as we call it. That creed really dates back to the Council of Constantinople, which resolved the Trinitarian crisis in the 4th century, which stated that Spirit proceeds from the Father. So it doesn't deny that the Spirit proceeds from the Son also, but it only explicitly mentions the Father. And the East, of course, objected to it both on ecclesiological and theological grounds. So it does represent a different way from our perspective of viewing the Trinity. Although the Western Church generally had no intention of undermining the monarchy, as it's called, of the Father, nor did the East wish in the slightest to detract from the Son and his status as one with the Father and the Holy Spirit from eternity. So in that sense, it does matter and does represent two very different strands. It's given rise to polemics on both sides. And so the East say, some of them used to say, I think that's perhaps more accurate, that the filioque was responsible for the rise of the papacy. It's difficult to see how that actually was the case. Whereas on the West, they say that the East is given over to unbridled mysticism. There's perhaps a grain of truth in that, but we've seen plenty of mysticism in the Western Church, in both Rome and in some branches of Protestantism as well. So there's a lot of polemical arguments which perhaps don't carry as much weight as their proponents might have thought. Now, I think the main difference really in reality is it affects the view of salvation. So, for example, in the Greek and Russian churches, it's very strong emphasis upon the Spirit. And salvation is viewed as theosis, deification. So the East has very much a pneumatic-centric, spirit-centered view of salvation, whereas in the West, the focus is, of course, upon the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ, the Son. And that is shared by both Rome and Protestantism, although the answers they give to it are, of course, different. Is the filioque essential? Well, Gerald Bray has argued that, and I tend to agree with him, that the Reformed and Protestant view of salvation and Christian life is unthinkable without the filioque. And Karl Barth thought pretty much the same too, had a very strong defense of the filioque in his Church Dogmatics. Now, I think that there is a way of saying that both of these views are not necessarily antithetical, in the sense that the Spirit is the one who transforms us into the image of Christ. And the Eastern Church also has a very strong focus upon the cross and the resurrection. Its liturgy for Easter week is very extensive. And so on. So it's not that one is heretical and the other is orthodox. And in fact, it has been proposed that the Spirit agreement can be reached, and has on a limited extent, on the phrase, the Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. Really, the Eastern view goes way back to Irenaeus, who said that if you really want to understand about the Trinity, go to the Jordan, where Jesus was baptized. There, the Spirit came down upon him from the Father, declaring him to be God's beloved Son. And then the Son poured the Spirit out upon his people.